You walk outside, you see a tree, and you think, of course it grows from the ground. Simple, intuitive, end of story. But physics has a habit of destroying obvious stories. Because if you actually ask what is happening when a tree grows, you quickly realize something strange. The ground is not making the tree. The soil is not magically transforming into wood. The earth is not becoming branches. So where does the tree actually come from? It sounds like a silly question until you follow it. Seriously. Because a tree is not just a single object, it is a huge organized structure of atoms. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, minerals, all arranged in an incredibly precise pattern that turns invisible gas in the air, sunlight, and tiny amounts of nutrients in the soil into something solid, living, and tall. And here is the first shock. Most of the mass of a tree does not come from the ground at all. It comes from the air. Now, that should already feel wrong in your intuition, because we are used to thinking of growth as pulling stuff from below. But nature doesn't work like that. It is constantly converting invisible things like carbon dioxide into structure through processes we barely notice. So when you look at a tree, you are not looking at something that simply grew out of the ground. You are looking at a system that is continuously reorganizing the universe around it, turning light, air, and chemistry into geometry. And once you see that, the question changes completely. It is no longer how do trees grow. It becomes what is actually building them. When people look at a tree, the most natural assumption is that it is made from the ground it grows in. The roots go into the soil, so it feels intuitive that the soil is being turned into wood, bark, and leaves. This idea is so automatic that almost nobody questions it. But when you actually break down the physics and chemistry of what a tree is made of, that intuition turns out to be misleading in a very fundamental way. A tree is a structure built from atoms arranged in extremely specific patterns. Those atoms are not just randomly taken from the soil in large quantities and reshaped. The dominant element in a tree's mass is carbon. Carbon is the backbone of almost all organic matter. And where does that carbon come from? Not from the soil in any significant amount, but from carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. Trees take in carbon dioxide through tiny openings in their leaves called stomata. This gas is invisible, weightless in everyday perception, and constantly surrounding us without being noticed. Yet it contains the carbon atoms that form the majority of the tree's solid structure. Through a process powered by sunlight, the tree extracts carbon from CO2 and incorporates it into sugars and eventually into cellulose, lignin, and other complex organic molecules that make up wood and plant tissue. This means that when a tree grows taller and thicker, most of that added material is not coming from below the ground, but from the air above and around it. The soil does contribute certain essential elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and trace minerals, but these make up only a very small fraction of the total mass. They are crucial for biochemical processes, but they are not the main building blocks of the structure itself. So the common mental image of a tree pulling itself up from the earth is incomplete. The roots are not pipelines turning dirt into wood. They are more. Like intake systems for water and minerals, while the true source of mass is atmospheric gas being converted into solid structure. In a very real sense, a tree is a system that converts invisible air into visible form. This shift in understanding changes how you interpret growth itself. Growth is not just accumulation from below. It is a redistribution and transformation of matter from multiple sources, primarily the atmosphere, organized into stable patterns by biological processes. The ground provides stability, anchoring, and nutrients, but it is not the main source of the material that builds the tree's body. Once you see this clearly, a tree stops being something that comes out of the soil in a simple mechanical sense. It becomes a structure that is continuously extracting material from the air and reorganizing it into a self-supporting form. Where what you perceive as wood is largely atmospheric carbon that has been captured, processed, and locked into long-term molecular architecture by living chemistry operating over time at a massive scale that is completely hidden from everyday intuition about where solid matter actually originates in growing systems like this, if most of a tree's mass is not coming from the soil. Then the next question becomes even more interesting. How does something as solid as wood actually emerge from something as invisible as gas and light? This is where photosynthesis becomes the key process, and it is far stranger than it first appears. At the core of a tree's growth is a continuous energy conversion process. Sunlight carries energy in the form of photons, and when that light hits the surface of leaves, it is absorbed by a pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is not just a coloring agent, it is a highly specialized molecular system that captures light energy and converts it into chemical energy. That energy is then used to drive reactions that would not occur on their own without an external energy source. Inside. The leaf carbon dioxide molecules from the air enter through microscopic pores, and water is transported from the roots upward through an internal vascular system. These two simple substances, CO2 and H2O, are broken apart and rearranged using the energy captured from sunlight. The carbon atoms are extracted from carbon dioxide and reassembled into glucose, a sugar molecule that stores energy in chemical bonds. Oxygen is released as a byproduct and returns to the atmosphere. This process is not just about making sugar for temporary energy use. It is the foundation of all plant structure. The glucose produced is not left as a simple sugar floating around. It is chemically transformed into long chains of molecules like cellulose, which forms the rigid structure of cell walls, and lignin, which adds strength and rigidity to wood. Over time, these molecules accumulate and organize into the complex architecture we recognize as branches, trunks, and roots. What is important here is that sunlight is not just helping the tree grow. It is literally powering the rearrangement of atoms from one stable configuration into another. Without that input of energy, carbon dioxide and water would remain in their simple forms. They do not spontaneously turn into solid structures. Energy is required to push matter into more complex, ordered arrangements. So in a very real sense, a tree is a machine that converts electromagnetic energy from the sun into chemical bonds that store that energy in physical form. It takes low-density gases from the air, water from the ground, and photons from the sun, and combines them into dense, structured matter. The solid trunk of a tree is essentially stored sunlight, locked into molecular architecture over time. This changes the intuition about what growth really means. Growth is not simply getting bigger by absorbing material from below. It is a continuous transformation process where energy and matter from different sources are reorganized into stable macroscopic structure. The tree is not passively accumulating mass. It is actively constructing itself by using external energy to reshape the surrounding environment into a highly ordered biological form. That maintains itself through constant chemical and physical processing at every level of its structure simultaneously once you realize that a tree is not simply pulling material from the soil, but actively constructing itself using carbon from the air and energy from sunlight. The idea of what a living structure actually is starts to change completely. A tree is no longer just an object sitting in space. It becomes a continuous process, something that exists only because energy is constantly flowing through it and matter is constantly being rearranged at microscopic scales. Inside every part of the tree, there is an enormous amount of organization happening at the molecular level. Cells are dividing, expanding, and differentiating into specialized structures. Some cells become part of the transport system that moves water and nutrients upward and sugars downward. Some become structural support that allows the tree to stand against gravity. Some remain flexible to allow growth at the tips of branches and roots. None of this happens randomly. It is guided by chemical signals, genetic instructions, and feedback from the environment. What makes this even more interesting is that all of this structure is being maintained far from equilibrium. In physics, systems naturally tend toward disorder unless energy is continuously supplied. A tree is constantly fighting that tendency. It is not a static object. It is an active system that requires a constant flow of energy to maintain its internal order. Without sunlight, without water, without carbon dioxide, the entire structure would gradually break down. So what we call a tree is really a stabilized pattern in a dynamic flow of energy and matter. It is like a whirlpool in a river. The water keeps moving through it, but the shape persists as long as the flow continues. In the same way, atoms are continuously entering and leaving the tree. Water is absorbed and transported. Carbon dioxide is taken in and converted. Oxygen is released. Nothing is permanently fixed except the pattern of organization itself. Even the solid appearance of wood is misleading at a deeper level. If you zoom far enough into it, you find that it is made of molecules held together by electromagnetic forces. Those molecules are not static either. They are vibrating, interacting, and exchanging energy. The rigidity we perceive is a large-scale effect of countless microscopic interactions maintaining structural stability. This means that a tree is not a single thing in the usual sense. It is a sustained process of self-construction. It is continuously rebuilding itself using external resources, transforming invisible inputs like light, gas, and water into visible, stable architecture. The boundaries we draw around Its dash trunk, branches, leaves dash are useful for description, but underneath those boundaries is a constant flow of physical transformation. From this perspective, the distinction between object and process starts to blur. A tree is both something you can point to and something that is happening over time. Its existence depends not on being a fixed object, but on maintaining a balance of energy flow and molecular organization that allows structure to persist even while every component of that structure is in constant motion, exchange, and transformation at scales far below direct perception, governed entirely by physical laws that operate continuously without pause or distinction between growth and maintenance as separate phenomena. If you follow this idea far enough, the distinction between tree, soil, air, and sunlight starts to break down in a very uncomfortable way. What we usually think of as separate objects begins to look more like a single continuous physical system exchanging energy and matter in different forms. The tree is not isolated from its environment. It is a localized pattern inside a much larger flow of interactions. The soil, for example, is not just a passive source of nutrients. It is a dynamic chemical environment filled with decaying organic matter, microbial life, water cycles, and mineral exchanges. Roots do not simply take from it. They participate in constant exchange with it, shaping and being shaped by it. Fungi form networks that connect trees. Underground, transferring nutrients and chemical signals across large distances. In that sense, what we call a single tree is already part of a distributed system that extends beneath the ground in ways that are not visible from the surface. Above ground, the same integration continues. The air is not empty space surrounding the tree. It is a mixture of gases in constant motion, carrying carbon dioxide, water vapor, heat, and energy. Leaves interact with this moving environment at microscopic scales, regulating gas exchange through tiny pores that open and close depending on temperature, humidity, and internal chemical states. Sunlight is not just illumination. It is a stream of energy that continuously drives the chemical transformations that maintain the tree's structure. When you combine all of this, the idea of a tree as a separate object becomes less precise. It is more accurate to think of it as a temporary stabilization within a network of flows. Carbon flowing from air to biomass, water flowing from soil to atmosphere, energy flowing from the sun into chemical bonds and eventually back into heat. The boundaries we draw are practical, not fundamental. From a physics perspective, this is very similar to how we understand other systems. A hurricane is not a fixed object, it is a pattern in atmospheric dynamics. A flame is not a thing, it is a reaction front sustained by continuous energy input. In the same way, a tree is a long-lived pattern in biological, chemical, and physical processes. It persists because the conditions that support it remain stable over time. This also changes how we think about identity. If the material inside a tree is constantly being exchanged with the environment, then what exactly is the same tree over years or decades? The atoms that make up its trunk today are not the same atoms that were there years ago. They have been replaced, rearranged, and recycled. What remains is not the material, but the organizational pattern that it continues to reproduce itself. So the deeper picture is not one of isolated objects growing independently from the ground, but of continuous systems exchanging energy and matter across multiple scales. The tree is one visible expression of a larger physical process that includes atmosphere, soil, sunlight, microorganisms, and time itself, all interacting through the same underlying laws that govern how energy flows, how matter reorganizes, and how stable structures can persist temporarily within. An environment that is constantly in motion at every level, from molecular interactions to planetary cycles that sustain the conditions necessary for such complex patterns to exist at all, without ever being truly separate from the systems that produce them. So when you really strip away the intuition, a tree stops being something growing from the ground and becomes something far more interesting, a living process that turns air, water, and sunlight into structure, constantly rebuilding itself. Through invisible physical transformations, what looked simple at the surface turns into a deep exchange of energy and matter happening across the entire environment. The ground, the air, the light, they are not separate contributors in the way we usually imagine. They are a part of one connected system, and the tree is just a stable pattern inside it.